Hey everyone. Sinethemba Dlamini is a broadcast journalist from the Kingdom of Eswatini. She has a rich background in public relations, having worked as a stakeholder relations officer for 2 advertising agencies, which sparked her love for corporate communications. As a firm believer in equality and information as a tool for positive change, she joined the NGO sector where her love and fire for women and children led her to the first national campaign on the 16 Days Against Gender-Based Violence. With this experience, she learned about the rights of women and children and the glaring reality of gender-based violence. This also led to her current job as a reporter and news anchor. Her heart, however, remains rooted in issues of women, children, HIV/AIDS, and education. Participants, welcome Ms. Sinethemba Dlamini.
Thank you, Tina, and a very good afternoon and good evening to everyone joining us from different parts of the globe. I'm very, very, very pleased to be part of a conversation that I believe will provide us with an opportunity to reflect and revisit the foundation upon which the work we do is built. In modern society, ethics can be the difference between life and death, of ideas, of people, governments, nations, even civilization itself. Ethical guidelines therefore give us a way to analyze situations rationally and offer guidelines for the moral behavior that is expected in a civil society. As a journalist who has a passion for community development, I am faced with ethical decisions that need to be taken all the time, literally all the time. In telling the stories of survivors of abuse, people living with HIV, and very recently, even COVID-19 survivors who are in danger of being discriminated against, I have come to think that there's a few simple rules, and one of those rules is always to think what is the best benefit for the public, what we call the public good. And if you keep that in mind, you can hardly go wrong with an ethical question that you face. I believe the same is true for people working in the nonprofit sector. You need to hold the public's trust. As such, ethics is such an important part of what you do. We are having this session today in light of recent events around the WE scandal, and the danger of this, as has been rightly stated, is that all Canadian development NGOs will be painted with the same negative brush as we, causing fundamental harm to their reputation and relationships with the public. Ethical conundrums need to be confronted with courage, but also with compassion for those who will be impacted by the difficult decisions. But it is so important to set the example that others will need to follow. This has provided us with an opportunity where light has been shed on integral questions, concerns, and issues in our sector to come together and discuss, including the ideas of others, is a hallmark of great thinking and leads to enduring relationships. And with that said, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce our panel of experts. We have Shiva Mazrouei, who is an Iranian-Canadian researcher and facilitator. Currently, as the research officer at YWCA Canada, she's carrying out a national research on women's access to gainful employment, focusing on the barriers faced by made vulnerable women. Shiva has also led various initiatives and events focused on women's experiences, equity, and inclusion in her work in the nonprofit and humanitarian sectors. Her passion and work center themes of equity, belonging, education, and mental health, as she holds a Master's of Arts degree in political science and international development studies. Her research interests included the effects of conflicts on women, as well as gender representations in educational material and its effects on perceptions of gender equity. Shiva is fluent in English, Farsi, advanced in French, and is a complete beginner in Spanish. We also have on our panel, ladies and gentlemen, today, Christina Muia. From a young age, Christina has been passionate about poverty reduction and social justice, which led her to work and volunteer in the international development and public sectors on youth and employment. women empowerment, food security, and climate change projects. Her experiences sparked interest in how youth from marginalized and poor communities are involved in poverty reduction, which was explored in her master's thesis and led to co-funding Biashara, a multifaceted enterprise that showcased stories of Canadian women entrepreneurs of East African descent. She has worked with the United Nations and several Canadian international nonprofits and is currently a board advisor for nonprofit Canadian Samaritans for Africa. Christina was currently part of the OCIC Youth Policies Makers Hub and is currently working at TakingITGlobal as the Ontario Partnership and Outreach Lead and Data Administrator for the #Rising Youth program, which she supports youth to take up leadership and make positive changes that they would like to see in their communities. Also in our panel today is Faith Tanui, a software engineer, a community development specialist, a worship leader, and a travel enthusiast who is passionate about youth empowerment and unearthing possibilities in young people. She is the founder and executive director at PendoAfrica, an organization that empowers youth for personal, spiritual, academic, social growth, and economic transformation. She has experience in developing mentorship programs to improve the lives of boys and girls in her community and is responsible for having managed campaigns and running online activism in support of the girl child and provision of sanitary pads to girls in marginalized areas in Kenya. Faith is a 2016 Mandela Washington Fellow and the 2016 Social Founder of the Year awardee. She's also the 2017 Ambassador for Women's Ambassador Forum, amongst many other sparkling accolades that she holds. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in Computer Science, a Master's in Leadership and Nonprofit Management. And lastly, but by no means least, ladies and gentlemen, we also have April Ingham, who became the Executive Director of Pacific People's Partnership, in 2009. Since then, April has overseen multi-year Canadian International Development Agency funded projects for civil society conflict transformation in Manokwari, West Papua. These included the development of women's networks and cooperatives. April is currently director of the Canada Council of International Development and advisor of the School of Technology and Education for Royal Roads University, and it comes as no surprise, therefore, that she is an active member of organizations including the British Columbia Council for International Cooperation, BCICC. She boasts of an impressive career and record of service within the nonprofit sector, most notably with the First Peoples Cultural Foundation, Public Art Galleries, the BC Arts Council, and others. Throughout her career, April has successfully managed complex projects in a cross-cultural and multi-stakeholder context. Prior to joining PPP, she worked for 3 years as production manager for the nationally broadcast Indigenous Arts and Culture television show, The New Canoe, and was part of the development team for the web-based Indigenous language and archiving system, First Voices. Ladies and gentlemen, those are our panelists for today, and I'm very excited to be hearing from them all. At this juncture, I'm going to hand over to Shiva, who's going to be our first panelist to make a submission today. Shiva, over to you.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you to ICN for having me today, and thank you to Sydney, who actually connected me to the ICN for this opportunity. I'm so glad to be here today, and we're going to go ahead with the first slide. I just want to take a few minutes to also talk about who I am and where I come from, and also the land I'm joining from. So my name, as mentioned, is Shiva Mazrouei. I was born in Iran and immigrated with my family about 20 years ago to what is now called Canada. So I'm joining you today from the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Treaty 13 territory here in Toronto. And I am here and have grown up here as a settler. And I really share kind of where I come from and who I am because it's the lens through which I experience life. It's the lens through which I approach my work. But I think that our responsibility as well to the land and its people is also a huge part of ethical public engagement. And when we talk about ethics, So I've shared where I come from, and I also like to share where and who I learned from. So I mainly learned from the majority of the women in my life. So my mother, my grandmother, my sister, but also many women of color and Black women who have been in my life as colleagues, as friends, as teachers. I learned from the way that they carry themselves, the way they act, the way they live their values, and the way that they course correct. So everything that I know and I share, my knowledge comes from them. I credit it all to them. But any mistakes that I make based on that knowledge, I take full responsibility for. So I will start off talking about kind of a broad understanding. We can go to the next slide of what ethics and public engagement really are, or what they mean to me. So ethics, I think, as at its simplest, it's a system of moral principles, and we talk about morality and the philosophy of morality. And it really comes from a term that can mean customs, habits, and characters and disposition. And it's really a really macro view of our habits and our systems, which is a great way to think about ethics. But I also like to always remind ourselves to think about the systems and the structures that have set up what we acknowledge as the norm or as habits or customs. So what we consider ethical, we also want to always question where that comes from and how we came to acknowledge or believe that. And then when we talk about public engagement, for me at least, I'm talking in the broadest sense. It can come in many, many different forms. In my professional career, I am a researcher, so I do talk about the research lens quite a lot and how we can talk about more ethical research. But public engagement can also take the form of the way we do our communications, philanthropy, information sharing, and so on and so forth. So it really, public engagement for me, the reason why it's so important, it really informs who we engage, how we engage, but also how we are held accountable and how we hold others accountable. So we can go into the next slide. And sometimes what are the things that inform our public engagement, especially in our sector? We really do have to kind of think back first at the macro level. We're talking about the systems and the structures that inform our public engagement. And oftentimes in the international sector, it is traditionally a patriarchal system that has really influenced the way that we come to understand experiences. So a lot of the times it's been the male experience that's been centered, and our understanding has been centered around and built around, and our sector has centered quite often. And the systems and the structures within which we exist and within which we function really impact our experiences. So our experiences of how we experience the world, the different work we engage in, how we're engaged with, all of these kind of go hand in hand and form our own personal prejudices and biases. And we all have prejudices. It's because we've all been exposed to similar narratives over and over again, and our biases are based on our experience. They're usually an attitude or a perspective that's based on our limited information, based on our own social location in the world and what we've been exposed to. And having prejudices and biases, depending on our experiences, oftentimes lead to narratives that we come to believe or that we come to share. And the narratives oftentimes can become singular or repetitive. And again, in my work, a lot of the times from the feminist point of view or from looking at women's work, we talk a lot about the negative narratives that come to exist about women, particularly, especially if we talk about the international sector. So we can go to the next slide. And the consequences are often singular narratives or images or stories about women. And it can also lead to chronic exclusion. And really, when we have these biases within our structures, we tend to form who is centered. And by focusing on who's centered, we choose who then to marginalize. So oftentimes when we talk about vulnerable women or marginalized women, it's not inherently the women who are vulnerable, it's us who have created who we centered, and by default, we've decided that they become the margins, that they become vulnerable. So a lot of the, I think what might be familiar narratives about women in the international sector is the woman as a victim, women needing rescuing, women who are weak. We have a very singular definition of who we accept or identify as a woman. And that image on the slide is often not what we see as who we define as women. In the international sector, a lot of the times, women are either our second thought after we've talked about how, and my background comes from the humanitarian sector, so we're talking in emergency settings. after we've talked about our emergency operations, then we think, oh, if there are women, then what do we do? And that again leads to exclusion and marginalization. And we're all very familiar with women, and women's bodies are often used as political and economic tools in various sectors. And their agency is rarely centered, even though we know that it's oftentimes been women of color, Black women, and Indigenous women who have been really at the forefront of some of our most critical social movements. So questions for me to start asking, so it's great to talk about what's wrong with all of these things, and I can go on about that, but questions, we want to start to think about what can we do? What are some of the solutions? So questions that I tend to ask myself in any work that I do or in any work that I see actually comes from a tweet that I saw a long time ago from someone's classroom. And it really is asking these questions of who's telling the stories, who's benefiting from the stories, and therefore who's missing from the stories. If we're talking about our research, who is benefiting from the work that we're doing and who are we leaving out of the work that we're doing? If we're talking about public engagement and communications, in all of those respects, asking these questions will help us to at least form what are the approaches and the lenses that we're looking at and what are we missing? And that question of who benefits will oftentimes give us really great insight into whether the work is ethical or not and who we're really centering. So we can go to the next slide. And a great way to start to think about particularly different experiences and who we want to center is around intersectionality and an intersectional lens. I'm sure the majority of the audience is already very familiar with intersectionality, but I also always like to think about where that term came from and what it means. So it is a term that was coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a Black legal scholar in 1989, and it was in response to a legal case where the court was saying that Black women could only bring forward their case and say that they were being discriminated against on the basis of race or on the basis of sex, and they couldn't say that it was both. And yet you can't really separate the experience that you have based on your sex or on your gender. So it's really, it's a way to describe how race, class, gender, and all of the various other individual characteristics intersect with one another and how they overlap. It talks about how there's intersecting systems of oppression and privilege, and all of us, we possess different and multiple identities that will intersect, that inform each other, and therefore create our own very unique lived experiences. So when we see engagements or when we talk about women or experiences of women, a really good question to ask, or that I often ask, is which women? Which women are we talking about? How do we define women, and which ones are we leaving out? So even programs that are executed for women, sometimes they never actually engage the women in their planning, in their processes, or I'm sure many of us have had experiences where we've been, where we have gone to an event or seen some sort of communication meant for us women. So whether for me it's a woman of color, oftentimes I've seen events catered to women of color, yet I don't see any women of color at the event or speaking at the event. So there's a big disconnect in who and how we're engaging. So next. Now, talking about some of the really strategies that I'd like to share, and these come from my experiences, but I'm happy to learn from everybody else's experience, and that's why I'm so excited to be here today. One of the key things that we did for our research, for example, at the YWCA, was we developed a very clear ethical framework, and really having clear policies and tools and frameworks helps to build that trust that we know has been eroded and that we know that we need to build with communities we work for. So the framework really outlines how we function, who we engage. In terms of research, it's what kind of information we gather, how that information will be stored, how it will be shared. But it's also about giving back some of that agency to let participants know they can participate to the extent that they feel comfortable and to that extent only. I don't claim that our framework was perfect, but it's a way for us to at least establish how we function within our research and how we plan to go forward. And having those clear guidelines not only helps the audience or the communities trust and share more knowledge, it also helps for us to be able to hold ourselves accountable when we do make mistakes. When it comes to creating guidelines in all respects of public engagement, creating clear guidelines of how we function can be very helpful, because if you have new team members, you have new folks who are joining, those clear guidelines show how we function no matter who is doing the work. But it's really important that we co-create them and that we center the folks who we want to be engaging and who we want to be benefiting in creating those guidelines. And a really critical part is definitely considering all aspects of public engagement, like I mentioned, so not really focusing just on research or just on communication. And something that we don't often think about is actually philanthropy as a political act and as public engagement. So a great example comes from the Frida Feminist Fund. Sydney shared this great resource with our team. It's their resource mobilization and ethics policy, and it really clearly defines how they go about doing philanthropy and what their ethical policy there is. So it's a great resource to have not only for your internal team, but also for your stakeholders to understand what your ethical policies are. And we can go to the next slide. In terms of the planning and processes of any sort of engagement that we have, a good question to start with is who has decision-making power, who's making those decisions. Even when we talk about those guidelines, who is making the decisions on what those guidelines are and whose experiences are being centered. It's really critical for us to ask who we consider as experts and who we give the opportunities to talk about the experiences of others. So if we have men who are talking about the experiences of women in developing or the global South countries, we've got a bit of a problem there. We really need to center the fact and really acknowledge and work from the understanding that people are the experts of their own experiences, and they are the experts of their own lives. So really, who do we consider as experts, and is it just based on certain credentials? Also, this is where we would ask the questions of who's missing, who is not engaged, and we really work towards building trusted relationships, learning continuously, assessing and evaluating our own methods, and implementing our learnings. So that's where we learn, we unlearn, we adjust, and we keep going. And language, of course, always matters in terms of how we define terms, but also what we claim to be doing. It's really important for us not to be claiming to be doing something that we're not necessarily doing just because we think it might be the right words to say. And next slide. And finally, we have transparency and accountability. Like I mentioned, we are all going to make mistakes. I know I've made mistakes and will continue to, so it's really important for us to already foresee that and have a plan in action of how we will react when we do make an ethical mistake or when we do something that is harmful to others. So a way that we can go about doing that is confronting and unlearning our own biases and prejudices. Transparency is key in terms of how we function. What I loved about the Frida example is that all of this information is publicly available on their website. It's shared with everyone publicly so that everyone can understand the points from which they function. So it's really key when we do make mistakes also to be clear and honest about what the mistake was, and then to hold ourselves accountable and to apologize through changed behavior. A tool and a resource that I love is called The Anatomy of an Apology by Rania Al-Mujammer. She is a social justice advocate and teacher and educator here in what is called Canada. And the tool really talks about centering apologizing through changed behavior, shifting the focus from seeking forgiveness to really working on accountability and changed behavior. And I will share some links for all of the things that I've mentioned, but really key to really be able to adjust and do better when we do make mistakes. I think a negative example of a lack of transparency and accountability, what we're seeing in Canada recently was with the examples of data collection around COVID. There was not really clear understanding of who the data was being shared with. There was claims of the data now being shared with police, which can be very unsafe for certain communities. There's also now claims that there has been data that has been made unavailable to the public or to health professionals. And that's where we erode trust. It's unethical, we don't have the trust, and we really are not able to do our effective work and implement the work that we want to be setting out to do. So really, transparency and accountability are key in any ethical engagement. And I will stop there, but I'm happy to take questions later on. And thank you so much for your time and again for having me.
Thank you very much, Tina. That was such an informative presentation. I think I picked up so many different things from that. I just want to echo something that you said about patriarchy having influenced how we understand systems and structures and how we experience the world, and by extension influence our biases. And therefore, in the spirit of transparency and honesty, I have food for thought for our audiences. So something for you to brood over while we continue with our session. What are we doing actively to unlearn thought processes that have sidelined members of our community, such as women, people living with disabilities, and so forth? And more importantly, how can we, going forward, close that gap? At this point in time, I will hand over to Christina.
Thank you so much, Sinethemba, and for that introduction as well. And also thank you, Shiva, for setting us up so well. I do like how you kind of share your points, and there's going to be definitely some crossovers between what you said and what I'm going to say as well. And I'm really glad to see you here because we had Shiva at one of our panels a few months ago at OCSC, so it's really good to see you here. As Sinethemba said, I'm based in Toronto, which is also called Toronto, on Treaty 13 territory. And I was born and raised in Kenya and moved to Canada as a teenager. There were stark differences between my childhood in Kenya and young adulthood in Canada. In Kenya, there was a clear gap between the have and the have-nots, and I saw how wealth and poverty lived side by side. When I moved to Canada, I was surprised to see that poverty existed, but felt far away from many people's experiences. Hearing stories of Indigenous people in the North who lacked safe drinking water was shocking to me in a country that has so much wealth. Or even seeing homeless people, for example, when I was, walking back from school, or coming across, or hearing about, or seeing sort of women in shelters as well. All those stories kind of, shocked me because, when I was back in Kenya, we always had that, the global North was a rich place and they have a lot of resources. And so we didn't make assumptions that, there's poverty that exists here. But the difference is that it does exist, but it's not talked about as much, and it's kind of hidden to the eye for many people. And so being somebody that's always been so passionate about poverty reduction from a young age, I was able to notice, those issues right away. And when I was young, I started doing my work mostly around visual arts and writing to kind of understand how, how poverty exists and how to kind of understand sort of the differences between, socioeconomic disparities between people in a society. And then when I got older, I decided to, pursue a degree in agricultural economics and environmental studies, because I knew that agriculture is the backbone of many developing countries, and I saw that I could make a difference with that kind of work. And so that led me to an internship with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which was an amazing opportunity for me. It was one of the first internships that I got as well. And the internship was great, but it only paid me enough to cover my rent. And I had to dig into my savings, and even ask my parents or family members to support me, when I was living in Italy. And this made me think of how, youth who come from low-income backgrounds in the global South and even the global North are not able to access these opportunities, and made me wonder, how can I be involved in reducing global poverty, and how can I support other youth to kind of get involved in this conversation and be part of the change that they want to see, and especially youth who are experiencing poverty or in communities that experience poverty, and that's an issue that's really close to them. And so I decided to pursue a master's degree in strategic policy and innovation, where I kind of explored how we can address the issue of poverty and the issue of youth unemployment, which as many of you already know is a growing issue in the global South for a lot of young people, but also is an issue in the global North as well. And so my research looked at how young people could create their own opportunities and become leaders in their own communities through engaging in social entrepreneurship specifically, and how they could become change makers as well. And afterwards, I decided to co-found an enterprise called Be a Shiara with a friend of mine, where we kind of told stories of women entrepreneurs of East African descent in Canada and engage young people in Toronto in documentary making. And I led a project at TakingITGlobal that created opportunities for employment and entrepreneurship for young people in Rwanda through a digital employment platform. And recently, I was a youth policy maker at the OCSC, where I collaborated with other young people to co-create projects and engage community members across Canada on a variety of issues that included, basic income, for example, or kind of understanding mental wellness for newcomer communities in Canada. So my experiences, being engaged as a young Black woman and engaging other youth in public engagement is well reflected in an image which I can share with you after this conversation is over. It's called the Public Participation Spectrum. And it kind of looks at 5 levels of public participation. Being informed, being consulted, being involved, collaboration, and empowerment. And when you look at being informed and being consulted, that involves law engagement from both sides, while empowerment and collaboration involves high participation and high involvement. And so looking at public participation through this lens allows us to see how if you're informing an audience, for example, or if you're consulting with an audience, how that can be a one-way engagement, and how you choose at what points in time within the engagement you choose to bring in your audience, and how that also marginalizes the experiences as you choose which part of the experiences are the most important or relevant to kind of highlight. Or when you think about involvement, which is kind of like in the center of the spectrum, looking at how, again, you kind of choose to bring in your audience when you think they should be involved, as opposed to allowing them to be part of the process from the beginning to the end. And the collaboration and empowerment, as I mentioned before, involved a high level of participation from the audience you're trying to engage. And so thinking about how that could be a two-way street in terms of conversation, and thinking about how you can involve young people from the beginning of a project to the end, or initiative to the end. Thinking of how you could bring them into planning, for example, implementation and evaluation. So every step of the project, they're involved and they're contributing, and they're relevant members of the discussion as well. And so, when engaging young people, it's important that we do not work by informing or consulting, and that we center youth voices and youth experiences in programs that involve young people. It's important that our work with young people, whether in the global north or south, involves supporting them to develop their own leadership potential so that they can leave our initiatives and programs feeling empowered to make a change in their communities. And empowerment involves, as I mentioned, bringing youth through a project or an initiative from the planning stage, implementation, execution, evaluation, through all the stages of a project or a program or an initiative. And so, if you choose to bring a young person into a program or initiative at the very end, and you kind of, things don't work out as you kind of envision, then, then, the fault is kind of on you because you didn't actually involve them from the beginning, But once you involve them from the beginning, and you kind of see issues coming up, and you can actually resolve them very quickly throughout the project or the program process as well. And so it's important to also think about how we can fairly compensate young people for their time and experiences as well. So I see a lot of young people, volunteering their time for organizations, giving their time to organizations, and, don't feel like they're being compensated at all. And this doesn't have to be financial. You could compensate them in different ways. That could involve, covering the transportation costs, for example, buying them food if they do come to an event that you're hosting, giving them references for a job so they can actually be able to move forward in their career. Because sometimes people volunteer because they want to build up their career and their professional, aspirations. So thinking about how you can support the young person so that they can actually be able to stand on their feet. Or even giving them an honorarium. It doesn't have to be a lot of money. It could even be, $50. If they volunteer their time to your organization for an hour, 2 hours. If they share their stories with you about their experiences, how can you compensate them in a way that you can value the experiences as well? And so, like in my own experience, when I was engaging young people as a young person myself, I'd be a sharer. We provided TTC tokens for young people to be able to travel to different places that we were showing the documentary with our women entrepreneurs. And we also paid for food for them as well on days when they were volunteering with us. So that's a way that we were trying to kind of support young people so they can be able to get involved in our project. Because our assumption was that these youth come from different economic backgrounds, and we don't want to make an assumption that everybody's able to afford to come to be involved in our project. And so if you're holding an event for young people, being able to cover costs for travel or even food during an event is something so may not cost you too much, but it's something that can go a long way for a young person. And where I currently work right now at TakingITGlobal in the Rising Youth program, We have youth who completed their project successfully, and they've been able to take up opportunities with TakingITGlobal in different aspects. So sometimes we support them to kind of understand how to facilitate workshops, if that's what they want to do, or host youth drop-ins, or even host events as well. And in these situations, we compensate them financially through honorariums. And so that's a way that we are supporting young people even after they've completed their project, to be able to continue taking on leadership in different aspects of community. And when engaging youth, it's also important for us to not treat young people as a homogeneous group. I guess that's kind of what Shiva was talking about before when she talked about, looking at women in a single lens, or understanding women in a single lens, and kind of using that way as a way of building our understanding of that specific group. And so it's important that we allow for diverse youth voices and experiences as well. And so when developing programs and initiatives, we should consider having diverse images and stories of young people, so that youth of different backgrounds, abilities, or genders feel comfortable engaging with our programs or attending our events. So if you're looking to engage, underrepresented youth in your organization, make the event space or engagement inclusive and accommodating. So that could involve, changing up the images you have on your organization space, on your website as well, on your social media, to reflect the diversity that you want to bring in, and also to kind of have it more welcoming to the youth that you also want to attract as well. And so thinking about, different aspects of the organization that you could change up to kind of make them feel more welcome is really crucial. And, if you're trying to involve and engage, Black youth, Indigenous youth, queer youth, youth of color, or youth with disabilities on initiatives and programs that concern them, again, it's important for you to be able to engage with them at all points of the planning, through implementation, through execution, as that allows them to also see themselves in the programs that you're creating and the initiatives that you're creating as well. And so, at TakingITGlobal, currently, the staff that we have reflect the diversity of youth we serve across Canada. And we also receive continual training, professional training, to be able to learn how to support and engage with Indigenous youth, Black youth, queer youth, youth of color, and youth with disabilities. And so even though even though the staff members are TakingITGlobal, we reflect that diversity in Canada, we also, have space to also learn how to be better and doing our work as well, and to be able to support youth who come from different backgrounds and experiences. And so, being a Black woman, I'm not coming here saying that I'm an expert in serving all, Black youth. What I'm saying is, I know what I know based on my experiences, but I'm open to learning and being able to receive training so that I can also improve how I interact and engage with young people from different experiences. And even though my work has been mostly centered in Africa and Canada, as I mentioned before, traveling to Central America, Europe, and Southeast Asia has allowed me to see that young people in the global South are facing similar challenges of high youth unemployment, lacking political and economic power in their countries, and feeling a sense of hopelessness for the future. And sometimes, youth are seen as a problem in society, and that sometimes is they're portrayed as like troublemakers in the media. And sometimes these images of young people can also affect how they see themselves in relation to the world around them. These negative images of unemployment, so this negative image coupled with, the challenges of unemployment or feeling hopeless could make a young person experience, diminished self-esteem, frustration, and increase the likelihood of crime, violence, and political instability in countries. So this is linked to how, sometimes young people end up joining, groups that could be considered violent, or, join extremist groups as well in different countries around the world. And so when youth experience hopelessness and they feel like they cannot contribute to the community that they're actually a part of, they're also less likely to engage in the political process. And so an example is youth voter turnout decreased between 2015 and 2019 in the Canadian federal elections. So youth are less likely to get engaged politically if they see that they're not represented, or if they see that their voices are not heard. And so it's really important for us to know that, or to prioritize youth, because youth are our future. Ignoring youth voices and leadership means that we're not preparing the young people in our countries and societies to become our current and future leaders. And at TakingITGlobal, for example, where I currently work, we support young people to take up leadership and make positive changes that they would like to see in their own communities through the grants that we provide. And these grants allow young people to develop their ideas and projects so they're able to actually make a tangible impact. And despite these challenges that I mentioned, we're seeing youth around the world, and even in Canada, increasingly employing creative ways to work outside the economic and political constraints that they face. And this is a wonderful thing. And I'm kind of going back to what Sinethemba mentioned earlier. I'm also going to touch on, the Me Too week scandal, because it involves young people. And, since I'm giving the youth perspective on the panel, I might as well do it. So my experience with volunteerism, started when I was in Kenya, when I kind of saw, young kids coming, into the country and kind of building schools and building clinics, or going to orphanages and playing with kids. And when I came to, high school in Canada, then, I continued hearing the stories of, young people going into those spaces and doing that as well. And even though Me Too, their aim was to mobilize youth to kind of make positive changes, how they went about it wasn't right, because they kind of, they sold volunteerism to white privileged youth who went on short-term contracts to build schools and play with orphans. And this model of volunteerism did not allow, the young people to actually delve into the real issues of development. Development is not simple, it's complex, it's multi-layered. There are a lot of issues, there are a lot of moving pieces, within that sector. And so like presenting an image that shows that it's a simple issue that you can just go in and kind of resolve through one way, is not a way to allow the youth to be able to understand what development actually is about. And then, the young people also make assumptions that people in the global south are helpless, they're poor, and also incapable of doing things for themselves. And that also emphasizes the YWCA mentality that's prevalent in development. So instead of actually building leaders who can see the world in a different lens, it kind of takes us back to how things used to be. And so this is a real challenge because as I mentioned before, youth are our future, so we should be able to support you to understand the issues of power and privilege, as well as YWCA mentality that is so prevalent in development. And so the issue with sending youth volunteers in the global south to complete projects is that sometimes the youth are left with the feeling of feeling that they're actually helping people, but in the long run they're actually harming, because these short-term interventions are not sustainable in the long term. The short-term interventions actually leave communities feeling helpless instead of empowered. And volunteerism is an outdated model that emphasizes that since the flow of funds comes from the global north mostly, so should their ideas, expertise, and interventions in development. And that's not the right way of looking at the issues. Also, hiring inexperienced youth from the global north to build schools and clinics undermines the experience of youth living in the global south. There's already a challenge of youth unemployment in these countries, and so maybe hiring young people in the global south to work closely with youth in the global north will address the issue of youth unemployment and also allow the youth in the global north to be able to exchange ideas and learn from the youth in the global south. So it's an opportunity for us to learn from one another within that space, as opposed to assuming that one group knows more than the other. But on the contrary, though, I have seen internships that actually work, having youth who come from the global north into the global south. An example is that, I was an intern with Dlamini Economic Development Associates a couple of years ago. And we had a week intensive training that kind of had the young people think about, what culture are you going into? What's the country you're going into? Could you learn about the language as well? To kind of have them think about how they can be informed about the space that they're actually moving into, if they're going for like 6 months or a year. And kind of discussing, some of the complexities in the global south as well. And I also, was also privileged to work at World Renew, where, youth interns also went through a very intensive training that had to do with understanding power and privilege, and also YWCA mentality in international development work as well, and engaging respectfully with communities in the global south. And also being able to be considerate of different issues and seeking consent when taking photos or telling stories of people in communities in the global south. And so it's important for us to understand that young people can play a really vital role in community development and in public engagement. But it's important for us to also show them that international development work is complex, as I mentioned before. The issues are multi-layered, and the challenges that are faced in these countries in the global south cannot be addressed through informing or consultation, but require real collaboration and supporting communities to identify problems, create and implement solutions that work for them, and also have solutions that they can also sustain in the long term. I want to stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christina. I think there's a lot that that I can relate to, and we all can relate to, especially the issue of fairly compensating young people when you have them involved in a project. I think that hits home, regardless of where you come from. I know that that is an issue that even we that even we have had to argue and have conversations around in Southern Africa. So to echo your sentiments, you're right on the money. And I think it's going to provide all of us an opportunity to reflect on how best or how better can we do in terms of youth involvement, but not just for the benefit of the nonprofit, but it should be beneficial for the young people as well that you're roping into the project. Time is fast spent, so we are going to quickly move along to and pass the microphone over to Faith.
Thank you, Sinethemba, and thanks for that amazing introduction. Great job, Christina and Shiva. Yeah, my name is Faith Tanui. Joining you guys from Kenya. I am honored to be here today. Thank you, Tina, for the connection. I work with PendoAfrica, and like you heard before, it's an organization here that empowers boys and girls for personal, spiritual, academic, social growth, and economic transformation. So it's an all-rounded, holistic program that we run out here in Kenya. We work with boys and girls from the ages of 13 all the way to 24 years old. I have been influenced mostly, my mother inspires me, but through the organization work, I think I can say I have learned as I go, because my background is in computer science, software engineering. So just changing into the nonprofit world for me was more of a passion. I've been pushed by passion. I've been driven by passion, and through that, I've been able to learn on the way. So we've made mistakes, we've learned, we're open to make more mistakes and learn some more. Yeah, so what we do here, we run mentorship programs for boys and girls, and we provide underwear for boys, just to kind of boost self-esteem for them. We also have a mentorship program for girls, where we provide them with sanitary pads, and these two programs really are planned out around education and ensuring that these girls and boys stay in school. Then we have a program for teenage parents, where we give hope to teen mothers who have had babies at when they're teenagers. So we the goal of this program is really to prevent them from getting a second pregnancy or dropping out of school or getting married off early. Because once you have a child here, by the time you're 12 or 13 years old, you're ready for marriage, which I believe is not really the case. It shouldn't be that way. Then we have a rehabilitation program for our young people, where we take in youth who are going through addiction cases, drugs and alcohol issues. They're rehabilitated for 3 months, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. So just today to talk about public engagement, I believe as members of the public, we need to be informed about what is happening around us. We need to give a voice in decisions that are being made that affect us. We need to be part of the people that are sitting on the table while decisions are made, because everything that's done, at the end of the day, we get affected as community members. So this makes me actually think of civil engagement, because I'm a civil leader, and I believe the two are related. Public engagement, civil engagement, one and the other, just they follow each other. And as a community resident, I need to involve myself in the civil and political life of my community. So am I volunteering in my community? Are you, to be a civil leader, it doesn't mean that you have to have started an organization or be working in an organization of some kind, but just being a member of a certain community, be it your village, your hometown, your county. What are you doing as a member of that community? Are you volunteering for events that are going on? Are you going to sessions that the government is maybe organizing in your community? What are you doing as a member of whatever community that you're in? So that those two, I can't really separate the two. I feel like they go together. So as a civil leader, I believe it's my job to be involved with what's happening around me, and that in essence is just public engagement. So that the various forms, I would say, how I look at it of how public engagement could be. And I mean, there's times where you need to communicate with your community about a public problem. Let's say, just my focus today really will be more on Kenya and what I'm doing as a civil leader in Kenya. So when I reference this, maybe try and narrow it down to where you are in your community. So what am I doing with a public problem that I have in my community? Am I helping build a school? Am I helping build a road? And then public consultation. Do I have a background in a specific field? Can I give ideas? Can I give recommendations as part of a resident in a particular area? Then a third thing would be public participation. Am I getting involved? Like I said earlier, am I volunteering? Am I going to sessions? Am I asking questions as an active, community member? And then sustained public problem solving. Am I, apart from just getting involved, am I actually giving solutions for long-term problems that we go through in our various communities? So coming up from the global south, I believe, and just kind of going on with what Christina was talking about earlier, going on and just talking about lack of my involvement or our involvement in the community, especially here in Kenya, I would say would lead us to looking at the white savior model. And I'll just talk a little bit about that and kind of connect it with, when I, as a member of my community, if I'm not involved with decisions happening in my, maybe with my leaders or with my government or with various communities that are in my setting, it opens up for the white savior model. And what we define, Christina talked about that very well, but I could just maybe define it a little bit here. And how I look at it is the white savior industrial complex model. And I take an example coined by a novelist here, an American Nigerian novelist called Teju Kole, where people are rewarded from saving those less fortunate. And looking at this, we look at organizations that come from the West to bring aid to the South. So it looks like white people, I would say white people, just to be open and raw, white people helping non-white people, but in a context that can be perceived as self-serving. So we have, let's say we have resources, from the West, we want to help people in the South. We come up with, maybe if it's finances or whatever it is context that would be, we come up wanting to help people, but not necessarily to change the situation. We want to have some sort of self-serving. I'll just leave it as is. I think it's self-explanatory. So then why is the white savior complex harmful to the image of Africa? What does that do to us, to me in Kenya? What does that do to organizations in Africa? What I feel about this is foreign organizations come up to support projects in Africa. But when you receive funding, let's say an example is funding financially, either could be resources, could be in kind. When you receive funding, I don't think there's really an exit plan that has been set out. So most of the time you find that there's a project that runs maybe for a year. There is no plan that has been put up in sequence whereby after 1 year, this particular problem that we're solving will either be eradicated or things will be better, or girls will be now going to school, and early marriages will have stopped. There's no connection between the two. So it's like you come in with funding for a year. What happens the second year? What happens the third year? So do we just, so I think the most important thing I'm trying to say here is, if you work in an organization, in the West or in the North, it would be important to have an exit strategy. And what it does to Africans or to countries that receive funding at the first time, it really does create dependency. It does create a lot of dependency, and in that way, it doesn't help us to be self-sufficient in any way. So we're always depending on funding. Like I finish a program for a year and then I'm up again. I'm like, okay, hey, we've run out of money, we've run out of resources, our buildings are falling apart, help again. And then it also blinds us from recognizing and acknowledging our problems. We can't find the solutions to these problems on our own. Because sometimes when you're fed, it's all the time you're given food. You don't want to ask yourself where this food is coming from. So if you don't give me food one time, I'll be like, okay, I'm hungry, I need to find food. And if you let us find food, I think we will find food. Because it's available. We have a lot of resources here in Africa, and just speaking from coming up from the global south. And then also it kills the spirit of hard work. I'm not sure what really happened there. I think I'm still on. Yes. So it kills the spirit of hard work. I'll just keep going. I think. Great. Okay, so sadly, it kills the spirit of hard work for people. They're not resilient enough because you get free money, you get free support, you get free funding. There's no drive to work hard. So you want to keep working, but then there's going to be food at the end of the table. at the end of the day, so you're like, okay, what's the point of working hard anyway? What's the point of raising finances locally anyway if you're going to get money from the West? So does that mean that we shouldn't receive funding or support? No. I think there should be an exit strategy. If we're receiving funding, it could be maybe for some amount of time. It could be for programs that are going to make us be self-sustainable. And I think what happens, especially, I want to talk about a little bit about corruption in Kenya, just interconnect this too. There's a lot of, I'm not sure what's going on. I think we're still on.
We're still on. We're still on. Keep going.
All right, we're going. Sorry about that. Yeah, so we have a lot of corruption because people are not honest about the money that they receive. When you have so much funding coming in, when you have so much resources coming in, you end up thinking about yourself. And let's say you've applied for a grant to run a specific project. You end up pocketing this and using it for personal, reasons or personal needs. So most organizations may have been started with a good cause at the very beginning, but you find that along the way, there's so much resources coming in, there's so much, funding coming in, and you're like, oh my gosh, we're rich, we're wealthy, we're good, forgetting that this money or these resources are supposed to help you solve a problem that you're currently dealing with. So there's a lot of stories where NGOs or civil organizations have received funding, but there's no accountability. We don't know how much they received, where this money has gone. We don't have stories of change that can tell us, okay, this support has been able to help you make a difference from one point to another. So no long-term solutions have been given. It's like a one-time project, like I mentioned. We want to do a project for a year, pack our bags, leave. What happens after the year? Is this community able to support themselves? Are we able to be like, okay, fine, you're good, you can walk on your own, you're fine. So how are we implementing these programs? Just kind of putting that out for us to think about. And then connecting that, the next thing I want to talk about is how civil organizations are the voice of ethics and accountability. I believe we should be that. And I don't think all of us are doing that at the moment, but it's a call to action for all of us to be a voice of ethics and accountability. Is trust in civil society groups justified when it comes to giving voice to the poor? If I start an organization, I want to change, maybe, like I said, PendoAfrica, we do youth empowerment. You want to change the lives of teenage mothers. If you ask me today, have I changed a life of a teenage mother? If my answer is yes, I should be able to tell you how. And if my answer is no, then I need to close up my office and, do something else. So let's just be open and, be raw. And, we receive a lot of funds, but can we account for that money? Can we account for those resources that we've gotten, especially, I'd say, in Africa or in Kenya, to be precise? And then we have to be morally accountable, just to go with that, Organizations' accountability towards the people, it was established to help, towards the beneficiaries that we talk about. Are we able to face them and be like, okay, you started our program, your life has changed, you're now self-sustainable, you can depend on yourself. Focus areas. A lot of organizations do a lot of things. Initially you start with maybe youth. And then along the way you realize, oops, there's not so much support in youth. I'm going to do children. I'm going to do special needs. I'm going to do LGBT. So we need to have like a specific focus area and run with that. It would help us to be able to solve our problems for the long term. And also, as I said, also stories of change. We need to be able to share stories of people's lives that have been changed from whatever we are doing with our programs on ground. And then also, can we change tactics? Like now with COVID coming in, are we going to sit and say, okay, there's COVID, we can't meet, we close our offices and leave? Or are we able to transition with the times, with technology, with what is going on ground, just to be able to help our beneficiaries in the long term? So are we also taking part in public engagement sessions in our communities, either as individuals or as civil organizations? So we need to hold our organizations and civil bodies accountable. It could be the government, it could be just local organizations. If you're planning to build a road in your community, are we going to wait? Are we going to wait for the West to come up and say, hey, you guys don't have a good road, we're going to provide funding to build a road for you? What about us just getting together and be like, okay, we need a good road to access our homes, get together, do contributions or whatever it is that would take to be able to do that. Same thing with schools and hospitals. It will benefit and grow our communities for the long run. And I think the resources that we need to do this are actually at our disposal. So the last thing I'm going to talk about here is how then is our organization doing that? How are we getting involved locally? How are we engaging ourselves in the community? As PendoAfrica, I talked earlier about a program for teenage mothers. And what we have done, we work in the grassroots level. Like we go deep in the villages of West Pokot. West Pokot is one of the counties here in Kenya. It's up on the northern side, closer to the Uganda border. And it's a place where a lot of kids don't go to school. There's a lot of cultural influence. So what we've done, we change their mindset from being a 13-year-old girl ready for marriage to I'm a 13-year-old girl that should have dreams, that should be going to school, that shouldn't be having a baby. So we need to change their mindset. And even after that, we need to help them discover who they are, their identity as young people, as girls, as boys. Who are they? What are their capabilities? What can they do and accomplish? What are they good at? Their gifts, their talents. And then that way they can live to their full potential and be the ones that will come and be change agents in their community. When you talk about engagements in the community, at the end of the day, I mean, the work that we are doing as organizations, we're not going to be there for 50 years. The people that we influence, the beneficiaries that we work with, are the ones that should run with the ideas that we've come up with solutions that we've come up with, so that when it's time to park, when there's no funding from the West, when there's no building to use, their mindset have been changed. So it's just a matter of getting them back to school. So what we do here, we provide like school fees for the teenage moms to get back into school, because we believe education is an open door for many other opportunities. It's just us planting a seed and someone else is going to come and water it as they go. And then changing the cultural practices, just start with early marriage, ensuring the community understands the importance of education for boys and girls at that age. Then another program that we do, we call it the Believe, Belong, Become Recovery program, where young people go through a 3-month residential program for rehabilitation. We talk about them rewriting their stories. We talk about trainings, them working on whatever issues they're dealing with internally. And then we do trainings on skills, on employable requirements, on writing simple things as your CV or your resume, simple things as how to use a computer, how to type, agriculture, mechanics, stuff like that. And those are just the 2 examples that we work on, because I believe even as a small organization, it is our job to be the voice of the voiceless. It is our job to change the lives of the other people in our community. And as for me, I'm speaking of this as someone who had an opportunity to leave my home country to study away out in the United States, but I felt the need to come back home and just impact, even if it's impacting 1 girl or 2 girls or 1% of the population. I think I have played my part. And I think it's just a call to action to all of us here. Like Obama says, President Barack Obama says, in the face of impossible odds, people who love their country can change it. So whether you work in an organization or civil organization or in the government, whether you're the one who provides resources or funding, or whether you're the one who writes grants or does networking or fundraising, if you love your country or your home, I think it's your responsibility to change it. And I'm going to stop right there for now. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Faith. I think we all can attest to just how refreshing her honesty has been in this presentation. I know that some of the things that she touched on would have been offensive coming from the other side of the fence, but your honesty and your forthcoming nature in terms of addressing the proverbial elephants in the room has given all of us leeway to actually continue and have an honest conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome to our last, but by no means least, panelist. April, over to you.
Thank you so much. And I believe I have a few slides to share with everybody. Roshni, if you're able to bring those up, that would be great. But just to start, I'm a mixed blood Canadian with Welsh, French, and Indigenous heritage. I was brought up in Edmonton and slowly migrated to Vancouver Island. I am a guest living within Sauk Nation territories, also known as Souk, with an office in Lekwungen-speaking people's territories, now known as the Esquimalt Nation and Songhees Nation. And that whole area is covered by the Douglas Treaties. I just want to say how inspired I am to see how many people went into the chat and self-located the territories that they're on, the traditional territories, and acknowledged them. That is really special. And I just wanted to note that for those of you who would like to have a handy resource that gives a little bit of introductory information on that you could go to native-land.ca. I just head over to, yes, thank you. It's a great honor to speak with you today and to tell you a little bit about our important work. Our organization has just celebrated our 45th anniversary. We're Canada's only international NGO devoted to the peoples of the South Pacific. We work at the grassroots level in equitable partnerships to build just, sustainable, and equitable communities. We've had recent projects and current projects in Tonga, Fiji, West Papua, Papua New Guinea, and Samoa. Throughout our history, though, we have also recognized the shared values, commonalities, and experiences of colonization and globalization as faced by Indigenous peoples here in Canada, as well as throughout the South Pacific. It is for this reason that we facilitate knowledge and cultural sharing between Indigenous peoples, North-South, as central to our work. This approach is also novel in that it supports the universal goals of the SDGs. Engaging public is also central to our approach to build understanding, support, and solidarity for this work. We do this through public events, lectures, and communications, primarily held up here in North America, although our communications do reach throughout the South Pacific as well as in other parts of the globe. Doing this work correctly is of utmost importance, as the consequences can be hurtful in so many ways. And yes, at times mistakes are made. But what is most important is to own up to them, learn from the experience, and determine what you can do differently in the future, making corrections wherever possible as well. Can you go to the next slide, please? It's also important that we always acknowledge the lands and the peoples where we work as principles, for our engagement and to be a good ally. Right there in this picture, you see a respected Songhees elder, Joan Morris, along with Mark from her territory and our president, Muia. We're at an opening ceremony with a guest from Australia, Paj, and we are having an opening welcoming. Joan Morris is also providing a grounding so that people understand the territories that they're in. And to do this kind of work and to have the elders there is a really important part of our work. Joan also sat in on some of our planning meetings because for over 22 times we had put on what we call Pacific Networking Conference. And those conferences were primarily held in North America. We would bring up people from the South Pacific and we would create these exchanges of knowledge. And they were very successful, and they were themed according to what the priorities of the peoples were at any given time. However, working with Joan Morris, we started to transform how we went about organizing such conferences. And what that meant is by working with our partners at the university's Indigenous Governance Department and with elders and community members, we took the conferences and the gathering and the sharing of knowledge out of the halls of the university and onto the lands of the Indigenous peoples of the communities that we work in. So this led to beautiful conversations about land governance, about green energy, about cultural resurgence, environmental stewardship, and also ceremony, like what you see here today, that initial sharing. And this created a model that changed how we work in so many ways. Everything that we did was from then on, grounded in community with the support of elders and community members from both the South and North Pacific, as well across Canada. And this vision led to what has become Red Tide, which is an international Indigenous climate action summit. And the first one was held in Te Kaha, Aotearoa, New Zealand in 2018. And so that Red Tide movement is all about privileging and understanding Indigenous knowledge and understandings and experiences of climate change. They are their own scientists, and we recognize that and put that to the forefront, working in partnership with them. At the basis of a lot of this work and understanding is a very simple but very complex way of thinking about this work. And I borrow this with permission from the International Funders for Indigenous Peoples. And it's based on the 4 R's, which are relationship, respect, responsibility, and reciprocity. So those are really important cornerstones to having a deep relationship and meaningful relationship when working with community. So we have interjections, but that's okay. Can we go to the next slide, please? One of our really big events in Victoria is called One Wave. And One Wave started out as a festival, and it was more or less a fun community event, a showcase of artists and different cultural leaders. And it was about engaging youth and trying to get people to know a little bit more about our work. And it was very successful, and it involved a lot of community members. However, in 2017, our team was faced with a pretty big challenge. It was our 10th year of doing One Wave, but we were holding it in the year of Canada's 150th birthday, which is a very problematic thing to try to celebrate if you're an Indigenous person. And so we went to the community and we sat with the elders and we talked with the South Pacific diaspora and community as well. How can we properly mark this year? And out of that came a transformative vision that was given to us by Elder Skip Dick from Songhees Nation. And he said, let's not make this a show. Let's not make this a festival. Let's transform this into a gathering, one way of gathering, a place to have cultural sharing, that place to have community building. And out of that vision grew a beautiful project that was stewarded by Yelmer Wenstop, a New Channels artist from the territories here. And you can see on that picture 4 long houses. Those are temporary historic plank houses, at least the facade, and they were designed by community youth, each one of the fronts of those houses. And they represented the 3 language groups of this island, as well as the South Pacific House, which was designed by a Maori youth. So that was Kwakwakiwak, Coast Salish, New Channels, and then of course the Maori House. And on one day, on the lawn of the legislature, a community came together, 5,000 people in houses that were programmed by each of the communities. And it was a remarkable day, and it just completely transformed our work in another big way. So at that point, we decided it was time to also start learning and teaching the volunteers and the people that were reaching out to understand what we're doing and how they can also be good allies. And we went into a deep program learning, and we co-designed with a master's student from Indigenous Governance an allyship program. And so many of those allyship guidelines that we put together help to share the protocols that are inherent of some of the lands here in North America, Indigenous lands, but also in the South Pacific. So we're going to share those with you today. Because one of the things we found is that a lot of the volunteers that were coming to us really wanted to understand how to be, in a good place and working with Indigenous peoples, and how to learn more on their own journeys so that they could come to a point of reconciliation and to be a good ally. So if we can move to the last one, please. Creating a safe space and respecting protocol is at the foundation of all of this work. The Longhouse project that you saw on the last slide was quite historic. To have it installed on the legislature in Victoria's capital, to know that that was once a historic village site, and to have that amazing project really was historic, and it was award-winning. However, it was a one-off, so I thought. And then the British Columbia Council for International Cooperation approached us, and they asked us whether we would consider working with them to put the longhouses up again once more as a village in downtown Vancouver. And so we did this in Vancouver in June 2019 for the Women Deliver Conference. And possibly maybe some of you have seen this. It was pretty remarkable. But it would never have happened if we didn't engage in protocols with the local nations, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam nations. We built our relationships with some of those communities previously, but of course went to them to ask for their permission and their guidance for how to run these houses in a good way. So these houses that were staged in Vancouver became places of dialogue for any community group that wanted to come and program them over the course of that 4 days that they were out. in Vancouver. And at those houses, we also did cultural sharing. And we also had different groups that participated in presenting their own programs. It was a remarkable experience, and I was so thrilled to be able to be there and to help steward those houses along with peoples of the land that were from those communities. And I guess one of the highlights for me really is the ceremonies that we came to mark together. And in fact, during the Women Deliver conference, on one of the days, there was a national release of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Report. And this was a very solemn occasion, obviously, and it needed to be marked in some sort of way. And we were so fortunate to have partners that came together with us to do this. And that included the Moose Hide Foundation, which is men that are upholding women's safety and children's safety in community, as well as ICNEngage, which is an organization based here in Victoria that is about land stewardship and environmental stewardship with an Indigenous lens and Indigenous respect woven through. And what we did together is we put on the Women Canoe, Honoring Canoe ceremony. And starting from the conference center in Vancouver, 200 people walked with us in solidarity as we carried a young climate activist, Dlamini, in a canoe together to the longhouses. And we marked that in the most beautiful of ways. On the right, you'll see the Women Honoring song, where we sang together to honor all the women. And, you know, it was pretty deep and very profound experience, but it would not have happened if we did not have that proper foundation behind our work. So that's basically what I'm going to share with you today, is just to say that there's ways to do all of this public engagement in transformative ways. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, April, for that presentation. The things that you spoke about that resonate very deeply with me. I think as someone who lives in a kingdom, I live in a kingdom in Southern Africa, in a tiny, tiny, tiny country. And more often than not, I find that people who come into my country have all sorts of ideas and they're quite presumptuous in their tones. And they come in with programs that have been designed with zero participation or consultation from us. And it's a very top-down approach, which makes it very difficult to be able to effectively interact with the programs in a way that is meaningful and in a way that will stay with me long after the donors have gotten back on the plane, so to speak. So at this point in time, I'm going to invite questions, contributions, and reflections from our audience. This is your time to shine. This is your time to make contributions to the ongoing conversation. Okay. So while we wait on those questions, I have a contribution, or rather perhaps a question for Christina. Yeah, I have a question for Christina. Sometimes you find that when you go into certain spaces, the young people that you find, they are very dejected and unwilling to participate. I know that this is quite true for Southern Africa, but perhaps because of toxic patterns that have happened as a result of the coming in of the nonprofit sector. Some of them feel used. Some of them feel as though they were not involved from a genuine place. How do we correct that narrative as people in the nonprofit sector to ensure that the participation is actually meaningful?
Yeah, I think part of it, as I mentioned before, you know, with the images that we have of young people, you know, being troublemakers, that's probably one image that sticks with youth, and you know, maybe they may feel like they're not kind of welcome into these spaces. But also a lot of them are reluctant, I'm assuming, to engage with nonprofits, because they've seen, like, as Faith was mentioning, like some of the work that's done or interventions that are put into place don't actually work for the community. Like, they don't leave an actual impact in the long term. And so if they're seeing that, then they're probably thinking, why should I get involved if if there won't be any sort of impact. And also knowing that, like coming from, an African country, I also know that young people don't really trust their governments as much, just because, there's, as Faith mentioned, there's corruption, and, we see a lot of leaders who don't care about their people, and, don't care about youth either. And so, sometimes youth assume that any sort of authority in a place is probably gonna, try and take information from them or use their time, youth experiences, but not compensate them, as I mentioned before. Because we've seen patterns of, youth being involved in projects, but not being fairly compensated, or not being given a chance to actually express themselves and have a voice in those projects. Because sometimes we kind of involve them blindly and just assume that, we already know the experiences. And so, I think if we have a way to be able to let them be involved by, having their voices in these projects from the beginning to the end, I think they will be more willing to actually take part. And so, I think that's really crucial. Like, as I mentioned before, the model of empowerment, from the beginning to the end, they're involved, and also thinking of a way to compensate them, and also thinking of a way to have them think through how they can actually be solution makers to some of the issues that they're also seeing as well. Like, we don't have to come up with ideas. We can just, go to that space and just have a conversation of what kind of ideas or what kind of solutions do they think will work for them, and how can we step in and fund or support that.
Okay, thanks, Christina. This one is for Faith. Could you share some stories, Faith, of change from your nonprofit organization as it relates to ethical governance? Could you share some stories of change from your nonprofit organization as it relates to ethical governance?
Sure, I could share a story. When we moved to West Pokot, it's a new area of operation. We were fairly new in the area. We didn't know the culture. Where I work, it's not really where I grew up. I grew up about 8 hours away from here. So culture is a little bit different. So what happened, we engaged the local leaders in the community, because we noticed that there's a specific area that young people, like I said, at the age of 12 or 13, are ripe for marriage. So you'd find that their fathers or mothers would sell them off for marriage, and they would accept what we call dowry in exchange, like cows, cattle, camels in exchange for them. So what we did, we couldn't directly engage with the parents. So we had a meeting with the local leadership, who connected us with the area chief, who in turn connected us with one of the leaders in the church in that area. So we ended up having a meeting together where we enlightened them on importance of education, on effects of them marrying off their daughters at 12 or 13 years old, and the fact that their boys at that age are not responsible adults to be able to take care of themselves. So when that discussion we started the discussion going, and the community started realizing that there was something that we're doing wrong. And they were open for other solutions. Are like, okay, fine. So what ideas are you giving us? What else can we do apart from selling off our girls for marriage? And what I really like that happened is the teenage girl said she wanted to go back to school. And at the end of the day, her father ended up pushing for her to go back to school. So most of the time, fathers are decision makers. So once a father has said, this is the way to go, that's the way to go. No one can, not the chief, nothing, nor the elder can change their mind. So what happened, we were able to get this teenage girl back into school. She already had a baby on the way, but she got, she delivered her child, and then about 6 months, a year and 6 months later, she was back into school. So I feel us engaging the community and them speaking up their voices, we were able to understand why they were practicing their cultures at that particular time. And then us speaking out to them as well, we had an opportunity to be able to give them another avenue. Like you could change, don't marry with your girls at 13. How about you take them to school instead? So I feel like when discussions go on, we're able to exchange ideas, we're able to open up ourselves for new things. And that is, that's a success story for us. She's just about to finish her last year of Form 4, which is secondary school. But due to COVID, school had to be stopped. But she will be finishing up next year. So I'm really excited about that. Yeah, that's what I could share for now.
It's that's a very inspiring story. Thank you very much, Faith. For April, could you repeat the 4 R's and maybe expound a little on each?
Okay, yes, thank you, everybody. So again, that was the International Funders for Indigenous Peoples that had this list, and I'm very fortunate to sit with on a working group with them, looking at how to transform philanthropy, Indigenous philanthropy in particular. The 4 R's, as they define them, are relationship, respect, responsibility, and reciprocity. So the concept is you must have a relationship with the people that you work with. And in that relationship, there should be mutual respect, and respect for the territories, respect for the peoples. The responsibility is the responsibility that you have for each other. And the reciprocity is that there is a give and take, a balance that must be maintained in relationship. So that's in a nutshell. There's so much more that could actually go into it, and I know some nations would have different understandings or approaches to that because we're all so unique and different. Yeah, and some of the things that we've put forward in our good allyship guiding values, which I think everybody will get an access to, is like listening to the Indigenous peoples you've come to support, learning the cultural protocols, learning the names of the places, taking responsibility for your own actions and choices, and how you will move towards decolonization in your own life and practice, building and nurturing good relationships. You know, I think somebody had talked about an exit strategy, about, not setting people up for dependency. But if you're in good relationship and it's going to go beyond any particular point in time, there's ways to honor that relationship. And it's important to always think about that. And, to be humble so that it's not all about you. Don't impose, be present, be abundant, making space, embody allyship, and don't appropriate. So there's so much more that we could share, but we are going to be presenting those resources to everyone. If they're interested, we hope that you'll have a look and let us know your thoughts on some of what we produced or offered.
Thanks, April. Our last question is for Shiva. Shiva, how can we move forward with ethical governance using intersectionality at the local level, working with different groups of women?
Thanks so much for that question. Very easy, small question just to end the day. I think intersectionality has to be the lens and the way that we approach all of our actions and all of our projects. And I think when we talk about any sort of local work, no matter the size of the project or the engagement that we're looking at, we really have to, again, question who we want to benefit, who we want to engage, and center them from the beginning. I think it's been a point brought up by all of these excellent panelists, who I'm so glad I had the chance to listen to, is that we really need to be having genuine relationships and genuinely centering the people we want to benefit. So whether that's youth, whether that is people who are the stewards of the land, it should be them who decide what's needed and define what's needed and how we're going to go about doing it. Building a program, a project, a process, and then deciding to ask, does this make sense, or implementing it and then trying to apologize for it doesn't make intuitive or logical sense. It makes much more sense to center those who we want to benefit, ask and see what they ask for, how they want to approach, and figure out what our role in that can be, so how we can best support. And I think that's the best way that we can go forward in any local projects.
You're muted.
Sinethemba, you're muted.
Hi. Oh, and I just said and I just made such a beautiful speech. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I know that this has been a very enriching conversation for me. I'm inspired, I'm empowered, and more importantly, I'm inspired to do better even in the different spaces that I occupy as a journalist in my work, and I hope that the same is true for all of us. Thank you so much for joining us on our webinar, and we hope to speak to and see all of you soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.